Welcome to a slightly warm and sweaty soils tent for the next hour or so. We're going to be talking about what's the evidence for regenerative practices, or perhaps more pertinently, what's the lack of evidence, or what evidence do we need. This session has been jointly organised by the British Ecological Society, who Nicola will tell us about shortly, have been doing a review on the available evidence and evidence gaps, and Rothamsted Research, which you know has been working for many years on providing the data and the evidence for supporting the decisions that you're all making. So today is really about what is it, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown knowns, that old thing. Just exploring between us what the priorities for research should be, where are the knowledge gaps, where are the unanswered questions, where should we be focusing our efforts as an R&D community. So we'll just quickly go down the line to introduce everybody on the panel. We'll talk very briefly for 5 minutes each and leave plenty of time for discussion and comments and questions from yourselves. So Nicola, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, hi, I'm Nicola Randall. I work at Harper Adams University and I manage a centre which works specifically on collating evidence to answer questions for policy and for farmers and for the farming industry. And Jennifer's next.
Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer. I'm a social scientist working out of the University of Exeter and the University of Oxford, looking at nature recovery policy and agri-environment policy. I'm also a hill farmer in the North Pennines up in Cumbria.
And I'm Andy Neal. I'm passionate about soil and particularly passionate about the microorganisms that live in it. So I spend a lot of time trying to understand what agricultural practices do to that living environment in soil.
Okay, thank you. And for myself, I'm Jonathan Storkey, working at Rothamsted. Describe myself as an agroecologist, and that means I'm just trained in ecology and trying to apply those principles in practical agronomic systems to maintain productivity and surrounding ecology. So we're going to start off. Nicola's going to introduce the work that she's been doing for the BES, so I'll hand over to Nicola. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Quite a few people have been working on a report for the British Ecological Society investigating the evidence around regenerative agriculture. So the chapter I've been leading is the chapter that's looking at short, medium and long-term effects and trade-offs. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes telling you some of the things that we've found on that. Jennifer will talk a little bit more about farmer engagement and working with farmers. And then Jonathan and Andy are talking about some of the work that they've been doing. So for our chapter, it's really very similar to the title of the session here, what is the evidence for regenerative agriculture? And really, I guess the question that most people are going to be interested in is it beneficial? Is it beneficial for the environment? Is it beneficial for soil? And what are your yields like? That's obviously fundamental. So what we've been doing, we've been looking at lots of different pieces of existing research and bringing it all together to try and find out if we've actually got answers to these questions. And if you just look at the colours on this chart, what you'll see, so this is just 2 interventions I've picked here, minimum and no tillage or cover crops. And what you'll see, we've got green, things we know that are good in particular areas. Orange, unresolved. Some of the evidence tells us it can be beneficial. Some of the evidence tells us it's possibly not, or possibly not so beneficial. So what you can see here for minimum tillage, generally a lot of the information actually isn't there. It's unresolved. So we know that it's potentially useful for carbon capture. We know the evidence that we found has said that it's good for biodiversity, and the last 2 are greenhouse gas emissions and pests and diseases control. So that doesn't mean you stop using it. What it means is there's evidence that's sometimes contradictory, or that maybe says there's benefits in some areas. So we know carbon storage, for example, appears to be good for the top layers of the soil, but maybe not make so many differences further down. Cover crops, the evidence is better established, and generally the picture's looking pretty good for the areas I've just picked here. As I say, we've got tables that could, go nearly as long as this tent. So I've just picked out a couple of things, but pretty good for biodiversity, carbon capture, pest and disease control. Maybe not so good for greenhouse gas emissions. So, and that's what we really see across the board, really. Regenerative practices have benefits and they have trade-offs. So if we wanted to say what does the evidence actually really tell us, if we then looked at this graph again, most of those boxes we'd take out because they're all unresolved. So the only ones that are resolved for these two, for the evidence that we've collated so far, is undercover crops. But they're all beneficial, the things that we think are pretty resolved, which is good news. What about if we look at short, medium and long term? Don't expect anybody to read any of the text on this. Again, I just want you to look at the colours. And what you'll notice is if we look at the first column, which is 1 to 3 years, the evidence is very, very mixed. But as you go over in time, as you move towards a regenerative system, what we appear to see is that yields begin to stabilise and can actually improve. So really, that's maybe what we're looking for, but don't expect a short-term impact, is what I'm saying. You might need to be in it for the longer term. And we think that one of the reasons for that is, so if we look at these longer-term impacts, the last column here, 6+ years is what we're talking about for longer term. One of the reasons for that is because what your regenerative system is doing, and hopefully it's doing what you're hoping it will do, it's helping you to be more resilient. So some of the reasons why regenerative systems might be better, you're increasing diversity, which means you're moving to you're making your system more stable because it's more similar to a natural system. That means you're in a better position under extreme conditions, whether that might be extreme weather conditions, etc. So improved resilience to change possibly is because your system's becoming more stable. However, I am going to end with saying that the evidence that I've presented is still only a snapshot, and there's thousands of studies that have been carried out, so we are trying to collate more of them and really find out if these are real pictures or whether for some of them we do know more than we've said here. So yeah, I'll move on to Jonathan, who's going to talk a bit more detail now.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nicola. So I've just got 2 slides, and really there's 2 questions uppermost in my mind that kind of shape the projects and the work that I'm involved in at the moment. That my starting assumption is a lot of the problems with agriculture in terms of agronomic and environmental sustainability we can trace back to our over-reliance on synthetic inputs, whether it be mineral fertilizers or chemical crop protection products, and that's led to issues with declining soil health, pesticide resistance, greenhouse gas emissions, all of the things we're very familiar with. So the opportunity with regenerative practices and regenerative changes in our system are to buy us the headroom to reduce our reliance on those synthetic inputs, to reduce the negative agronomic and environmental impacts of those things. So in my job, I use the term ecological intensification. And all that means is that we're looking to enhance the ecology of our system to provide the same functionality that we're getting from our agrochemical inputs. So can we enhance our system such that it naturally regulates the pests, weeds and diseases, it naturally holds on to the fertility, it naturally makes the water and the nutrients available to our crops and our livestock without relying on these open, leaky systems and these external inputs. And given that framing, there's 2 slides here that summarize a huge amount of work. The first one summarizes a big analysis that a member of my team, Chloe McLaren, did a couple of years ago, where she looked at data from 30 long-term experiments. So Nicola has talked about the importance of monitoring these systems over time because you see the benefits accrue over decadal timescales. So it's important that we do these experiments over a long time. So Chloe looked at data across the world for 30 long-term experiments that combined different regenerative approaches: integration of livestock, cover crops, addition of organic amendments, reduced tillage in different combinations, but crucially in the context of high or low synthetic fertilizer inputs. And her big conclusion was that the environmental benefits of those regenerative approaches are only realized in the context of reduced synthetic fertilizer inputs. And that's what I've tried to illustrate with these arrows. And hopefully your eye is drawn to that bottom middle box where we've got addition of organic material, plant-based composts or farmyard manures, alongside the diversification of the rotation with legumes. But those particular treatments also had lots of inorganic fertilizer put on, lots of inorganic nitrogen. So we saw no benefit. In fact, there might have been a disbenefit and we were losing more of that nitrogen to the environment. So the first key principle and first key knowledge gap is understanding quantitatively, if we invest in the regeneratively into our system, how much headroom does that buy us to reduce our synthetic inputs? The second one is combinations. So we all know that if you just do one thing in isolation, reduce tillage, cover crops, green compost, livestock in isolation, you might get limited benefits. The real benefits and real power comes when you combine interventions in systems in a targeted, strategic way. And that's what we're trying to do in this second piece of work, which is a new long-term experiment, which combines regenerative approaches in a systematic and designed way. And come and talk to me on the Rothamsted stand, and I could tell you more detail about that. But I've just pulled out a couple of results. Again, this is only after 6 years of the experiment, so we expect to see this change and get better. A couple of results on spring barley yields, where we have reduced tillage and we have organic compost, green manures added. Reduced tillage is reducing yields, and we would expect that in the first years of transitioning. Green compost is bumping up yields and giving us some benefit, and we're seeing an additive synergistic effect of that when we put them together. So this experiment is providing the evidence to inform you to say, if I pull this lever and that lever in combination, what would be the combined benefits? So again, if you want to know more, come and have a chat to me on the Rothamsted stand. And Andy.
Yeah, you just pop over to the next slide. So I'm going to really want to pick up that term opportunity that John just used, because if you think about 20th century agricultural science, soil science in particular, it was looking at the rate at which soils were degrading, and it was throwing up all sorts of red flags about the issues associated with that, and it was in return providing relatively simplistic understanding of how to use nitrogen more effectively and more efficiently in landscapes. The opportunity that regenerative agriculture provides us now is manifold. Most importantly is that we can now start looking at soils going in the opposite direction, and don't spend our lives being very pessimistic about soils are degrading, the way we farm is destroying everything. We can start being much more optimistic about, we can start to see change for the positive as a result of various different practices that are being implemented. So as a scientist, I'm really energized to think that we can start talking much more positively about what we're seeing in soil. The other opportunity, I suppose, and that comes from how much more complicated regenerative agriculture is that we now have to work with farmers, because we are not, well, except perhaps in that one experiment you've got there, we're not necessarily the best implementers of various regenerative practices that exist. In fact, we know our herbal lays down at Northwick in Devon are really not as good as many of you are probably growing on your own farm. So it means that we have to think much more openly about working and collaborating together to look at your best case management practices and understand the fundamental consequences in soil. And this is an example, and I should thank Ian Wilkinson for allowing me to talk about this. We've been working with Ian at FarmEd to understand what the consequences of his herbal lay incorporation into cereals, rotations, and also the consequences for tillage and min-till direct drilling. These are X-ray computed tomography images of the pore space in his soils. On the left there is a soil that has been under a 17 species herbal lay for 4 years. And the blue and the yellow describes the pore space in there of various pore sizes. And what you really want to see from that is it's very porous and there's a lot of connectivity between all those pores. So that soil, after 4 years of herbal lay, is in a really good condition. It's going to drain really well. It's going to have oxygen in there. And we now know if there's one thing we really should be protecting in our soil, it's this pore space. So if you look at the column in the middle there, that's the 4-year herbal lay that has been ploughed and power harrowed to go into a wheat crop. And the important thing to notice is a lot of that good work that's been developed during that herbal lay has been lost. I think where farmers and scientists can really start working collectively is to understand transitions between states and rotations, because that's where you have the opportunity to defend all that good work you've done, in this case with a grazed herbal lay, and make sure that you're carrying that over into the next phase of your rotations. On the right there is a continuous wheat rotation that has been, for the last 2 years, not ploughed up, but has been direct drilled after having glyphosate additions. And so you can see the consequences for ploughing here. You can see the consequences of trying to defend that soil porosity by minimizing the amount of disturbance that you're inputting into your soil. So I suppose the opportunities and the unknowns is how we manage soil to maintain that pore space, because as you can see, Ian's very good at making pore space in his soil, but it's the transitions and getting from one to the next that is really the interesting and the very practical issues that we can solve together. So that's what I wanted to say. Move on.
Sorry. Thanks. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the sort of evidence from a social science and a policy perspective specifically. So I was the lead author of the final chapter in the British Ecological Society's upcoming report on policy tools and recommendations. And this little diagram here on the right shows kind of how we understand the different policy tools and policy instruments available to farmers might support the adoption of regenerative agricultural principles and practices, and in turn how these principles and practices can help policymakers, communities, society as a whole in the delivery of wider policy goals in the context of the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, protecting natural resources and food security. I want to zoom in specifically, particularly in light of what we've been talking about just now, on one particular policy tool, and that's agri-environment schemes, and look a little bit at how ELMS and the Sustainable Farming Incentive is aligning with or encouraging, I know there's differing opinions on this panel about how that's going, how these might support regenerative agricultural principles. So the principles outlined here on the left of the screen are the ones developed earlier in the regenerative agriculture report, aligning with the existing principles that we see in much regenerative agriculture discourse and literature. And the actions on the right there are the ones that were available in the Sustainable Farming Incentive 2023. So these are slightly out of date now, and I don't expect you to read through all of the material I'm about to put on the screen, but just to highlight that there's a kind of there's a sparsity, if we look at this diagram, in the amount of actions available to farmers to support in their ability to minimise soil disturbance, to minimise bare soil and keep living roots around the year, and to reduce synthetic inputs. But what I want to look at is how actually some of these things have improved with farmer input in the Sustainable Farming Incentive 2024. So we've actually seen a huge expansion of options. And again, don't expect you to read through this diagram. It's really looking at the density and the sparsity of these particular options, and actually seeing that the available actions to farmers are becoming more dense in these key areas of concern. So we see that there are more options available on minimising soil disturbance. We now have that no-till option now. And there are more options available to farmers to help them reduce their synthetic inputs in particular. And so there's this higher density of policy actions which support regenerative agricultural principles than we've previously seen. So just to show that diagram in isolation, looking specifically at these 3 principles that were really lacking in SFI 23, in SFI 24, we're really seeing these start to come through. And so particularly on tillage, the SFI pilot and SFI 22 did have standards for no-till, but in SFI 23, they were removed in the initial pick and mix. And they were a little bit more restrictive in terms of farmers having to deliver 25% across all of their hectarage available in their pilot parcels, whereas now it's this no-till action is per hectare, so you can choose the amount of land that you put into the no-till action. So it's becoming a lot more flexible for farmers. There's still more evidence needed, still more involvement needed from stakeholders. I think everyone's kind of forgotten that ELMS tests and trials exists. It is still going, it does still exist. Farmers need to provide that evidence. I'm a very passionate advocate of these approaches. Co-design might not be perfect, but it is there for a reason, and these policymakers, in my opinion, are doing their best to help farmers, and the more willing farmers are to provide that evidence, the better. DEFRA doesn't really, they're not going to, the Treasury isn't compelled by the loudest voice on Twitter, it's compelled by the evidence. So providing input into these spaces is super, super important. And just to wrap up by showing the kind of regenerative agriculture recommendations from the British Ecological Society report. So we've sort of conceptualized this as a working tractor, if you will. So all of these elements are there to move together to help farmers along this regenerative agriculture journey. So for us, the wheels that keep farmers moving in the right direction are the advice and support. So we need to increase the access to and the quality of support and advice to provide farmers with the skills they need and the resources they need to be able to make the transition to regenerative agriculture, particularly pertinent given what Nikki said about that initial lack of sort of yield increase and support in those short-term years. What can we do to help farmers there? Keeping farmers in the driver's seat. Regenerative agriculture is obviously a farmer-led innovation, a farmer-led approach. So placing farmers at the, keeping farmers at the forefront of innovation in partnership with the scientific evidence that we're developing is really important. Agri-environment schemes are such a useful tool for enabling farmers to transition to these schemes as well. The money's there to be used. DEFRA is always listening to new to farmer voices and to the evidence that's coming forward. So the more evidence we can provide that these principles need to be supported through these schemes, the better. Alternative fuels, we really want to continue the support for research, evidence and practice, both across demonstration farms and through research and development and technology as well. We want to talk a little bit about certification schemes, so the shifting gears, the ability of some of these approaches, certification schemes in particular, and private finance in some cases, to sort of accelerate the process, if you will, to help farmers to move more quickly. And the counterweight is regulation. So regulation needs to follow on, to build on the existing progress that's been made with meaningful and accessible regulation, which farmers can understand, learn from, and have a clearer idea of what's there and what's needed. That's all from me.
Perfect, thank you very much. Would you mind just thanking all of our speakers for their time? Okay, so it's really now over to you, and what we want to hear now is just picking up what Andy said. We're so reliant on understanding and knowing what current practices and what your questions are and what your needs are of us as a research community, so we don't go off in directions that are completely irrelevant and detached from what your needs are and what we need to know. So if we can just spend 10-15 minutes, I know it's a bit warm, about talking about some of those unknown unknowns, if you like, that we need to be working on and are really priority issues for you. So are there any questions or comments on the research environment and needs? There's one down here to start us off. And if you can just introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Mead. I have an estate in South Norfolk. I don't know if I missed it, but I was looking to see what evidence there is that mob grazing is particularly effective.
Okay, You've looked at that in your report?
We have looked at mob grazing, not specifically for that, but actually for something else. And again, it's, and apologies because I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but again, the evidence is fairly mixed, but it looks as if mob grazing will help with resilience, again, for future, and generally for biodiversity. The studies that we've, as I say, I'm trying to remember exactly what, because this is a while ago, but studies appear to show that mob grazing is good for biodiversity. I can't remember off the top of my head what the impact is on yields. One of the issues with mob grazing is it's fairly new, so the evidence is in the UK, the evidence is quite sparse still. So most of the evidence for mob grazing comes from sort of more rangelands, the longer term evidence, which is quite different environment to the UK. But there's lots of current work going on, so watch this space because there'll be more studies coming out.
Right, at the risk of plugging Rothamsted, we do have a poster specifically on that on our stand where we've had a long-running experiment, generally beneficial across the board.
Hi, Rishi Winspear, RSPB. So obviously a lot of research and development has gone into conventional agriculture to maximise yield tons per hectare. Regenerative agriculture generally is driven by cutting cost of production, maybe accepting 10% yield loss. But in the longer term, do you think it is feasible that we can make regen agriculture more productive in the long term than conventional?
An excellent question. I wonder if we can just have a response from each panelist on that.
Thanks for that. I don't think I can answer that specifically, but I think part of achieving that will be understanding how we develop new crop varieties to function in soils that we are now creating by disturbing them less. So they tend to be less porous in many cases, and we know that roots will have a very different environment. The current elite varieties that have been bred to work in highly fluffed up, regularly disturbed soils. So some of those yield losses we may see at the moment may be because the varieties are just not developed for the new systems that we are now creating. So I'd like to think, I'm not going to say we will definitely get there, but I think there is certainly opportunity to improve the varieties we're using at the moment to do well in what we're creating now. So that's partly an answer, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer much better than Andy there. I think that resilience is not there in the current crop varieties. And from a livestock perspective, I'm not sure it would be desirable to be as productive as conventional systems anyway. Maybe it's more about less but better in some circumstances as a hill farmer in any case.
Yeah, really good question. And I think one of the issues is, or one of the other issues, building on what these guys have already said, is really our technologies. You know, we've developed agriculture to have bigger and bigger machinery, which of course then, machinery is just one example, but we've promoted monocultures really. And that's how technology's developed. But actually, there's work now being taken place that's looking at more innovative technologies to take us back to facilitate that diversity. So, for example, intercropping. To enable intercropping, it can be quite difficult if you've got very large farm machinery, for example, because those edge effects that give you the benefits in intercropping, you know, they're only a very small area if you've got a 6 metre wide strip. If you can carry out work with 1 metre wide strips, and you can use that as intercropping as a way of increasing diversity, then you have the technology to support the regenerative approaches. So one way in which we're doing it at Harper is we're using autonomous vehicles, for example. So we can go with much smaller vehicles to enable that technology to support the more traditional approaches, really. So I don't think regenerative agriculture is going backwards, it's going forwards, but we need to use new ways of thinking and new technologies to enable us to re-embrace things that perhaps we might have been doing, you know, a couple of hundred years ago.
And I would say yes, I'm an optimist. I think if you look over time, so we have a long-term experiment, the Broadbalk experiment, looking at wheat yields for the past 180 years. And okay, under conventional systems, you see the wheat yields going up, but the noticeable thing over the past 20 years or so is they go like this. So the variance in your yields year to year is getting bigger. So it comes back to this resilience. In a really good year, regenerative system might not be quite as good as, you know, your best system with intensive inputs or whatever, but you're mitigating the effects of the bad years. You know, you're mitigating those wet autumns, you're mitigating those summer droughts, you're building resilience such that if you look at the average yields over a decadal timescale, you'll get, you know, comparable performance. That would be my hypothesis that we should be aiming for. Yeah.
And there is some nice, sorry to butt in, but there is some nice work from the US Midwest looking at insurance payouts for yield collapse, that having more organic matter in your soils reduces those insurance payouts. And there's some nice relationships, particularly when you have extreme droughts. It's a bit like you were saying with your adding nitrogen. You see the benefits of regenerative approach when you have the extremes, not when there's a mild drought, but when there's a severe drought. That's where in this study there was fewer payouts for crop loss. So I think it's a variety of things, but that's regen ag, right?
Yeah, and the same goes for biotic stresses as well, pest, weed, disease outbreaks. If you've got a system which is regulating those populations of pest, weeds, diseases at lower levels, you're less likely to have these peaks, these epidemics and these outbreaks, and you'll be more resilient against those. Any other questions from the floor? A couple down here, yeah, okay.
Hi, thanks. I'm Georgie, Brave Farm Manager at RSPB's Hope Farm. There's like general practices for regen ag of what we know are good, but it's always the question of us thinking, okay, so what situations does it work best? How can it work best on my farm and under what seasons? And sometimes with advisors, they say, oh, well, you know what works best for your farm. And then sometimes when we talk to farmers, they'll say, oh, well, that won't work on my farm. Are there any tools in development? Do you think it is just sticking to the general principles, or is there things coming through so that we can refine it and ensure the best chance of us being able to do sort of those more resilient yields and make sure that it does work most efficiently?
Again, a really good and difficult question. Anyone want to take that one? You want to talk about soil texture, Andy?
It helps me shamelessly plug another session. Yeah. I think the point you raise underlines why we need to be working together much more effectively. And I mean, you as a cadre of farmers, first of all, but also us as scientists working with you to try and understand the landscape of what works where and what works better. So yeah, I understand the frustration, and I think partly we need to up our game to be working with you much more effectively, which allows me to talk about a session in Speaker's Corner at 2:00, where we're introducing a concept of how that might work called FIX, Farmer Information Exchange. And it's aimed at doing exactly what you're saying. It's sharing knowledge across broad landscapes to understand what might work in your situation because of evidence locally that it's working. So I think, yes, it's a real problem right now, but I think collectively we could solve that if we work together much more effectively.
I would agree with that, and I would also just say we've been working with farmers in the SFI pilot for a long time now, and the most effective lessons come from that farmer to farmer engagement, and you know this principle of know your context is sort of an undercurrent running through the British Ecological Society's report on regenerative agriculture and how important that is to each farmer. And this idea of networking between farmers, I've heard some incredible sort of anecdotes from different farmers about, you know, establishing a herbal ley in the uplands is very different to establishing a herbal ley here. And you know, farmers have said, okay, well, I went and I got instead of my usual splash plate for putting slurry out, I got a dribble bar through the productivity grants, and I just put the clover mix in my slurry with the dribble bar, and that's been able to, I've established my herbal layer that way, and that's worked really well for this upland farmer, 900 metres up, to get his herbal layer established, which, so these less conventional approaches, this informal knowledge sharing between farmers is the way forward.
You might like listening to what we have to say, but I bet you're going to trust one of your peers more when they say it works than us.
Yeah, when you hear it from the farmer's mouth, yeah.
So I think it's about getting that relationship. We could help you understand why it works, perhaps, but then your peers can work collectively to make it work better.
Okay, other questions?
Hi, Hannah Fraser, farmer in Yorkshire. Could I just ask, the pictures you showed of the soil porosity, so obviously after ploughing there's a big reduction. Is that straight after ploughing?
It was 4 weeks after ploughing.
And if you went back to that field, let's say 5 months later when there's a growing crop in the ground, do you think you'd see the same effect, or do you think that the biology would come back and actually you'd get improvement of that porosity?
It depends what's in there. I think if it remains under cereals, it might improve, but it's never going to get back to that lovely 4-year herbal lay. Some of the long-term experiments in Harpenden, where we've taken intentionally degraded soils, we've had to wait about 7 or 8 years before we can even measure something using that technology of improvement, even under a permanent pasture. So yeah, it's like reputation, right? It's very quick to lose a reputation. It's very quick to lose porosity and carbon from soil. It takes a long time to get it back. So we need to think about, well, I think we need to think about collectively, if one has to disturb the soil, what practices do we need to immediately implement to speed that recovery up? And we just don't know about that time scale, and there are so many different variations. But again, it all means that we should be working together, because you are all doing that unwittingly. There's this huge experiment going on out in the countryside that needs to be measured.
And I think just quickly to add to that, and go back to George's comment as well, that's where there's an opportunity for us in terms of, if we are able to identify what works where, we can come in and give an understanding as to why. Why do you see a different effect of this particular management on that soil type, on that environment, to over here? And that's really, as scientists, why we're here, to give that kind of underpinning understanding, hopefully then to be predictive and to say, what would happen in a new environment. Okay, next question. Yeah, just one down here.
Hello, thanks for the talk. My name's Ralph from Wageningen University Research. I was wondering whether you think that scientists might be taking a too much of a reductionist approach to regenerative agriculture, as you showed that when you combine different types of management practices that you see way different results. And do you think that this is like a good way forward, even though it's much more complex way of performing science?
Yes, go.
Really good question, but really difficult one. So obviously, if you've got multiple interventions going on your farm and you see some improvement, that's fantastic, but you don't know what it is that's caused it. So I think my answer would be, I think we need both. If we're going to really break down the evidence, so the slides that I showed at the beginning, where we were trying to break things down, sometimes the reason we've got those unresolved is because it is a farm where 3 or 4 different changes have been carried out at once. Or it could be because the situation's different or whatever. But yeah, and the other thing we need to think about as well is when you've got lots of things going on, there may be trade-offs between them as well. So from an experimental point of view, from a science point of view, it would be fantastic if we could maybe have experiments that look at everything broken down, but also look at them combined. From a farming point of view, you want to see results. So you're going to probably take the things that you think are most likely to work and implement more than one of them at once. So yeah, difficult answer, a difficult question, and I don't think I can answer it, but I do think we need both approaches.
Yeah, and kind of related to that is getting different disciplines to work together. So your entomologist might work on a system and say this is the best way to manage your beneficials or your all-seed rate pests. there might be conflicts with the soil scientists who say, no, you want to do it this way. So as well as avoiding reducing the system too much, it's also working together across disciplines. I think we're getting better as a scientific community at doing that, but it's absolutely crucial. So I agree. I think there's a danger with breaking the system down too much, and we should avoid it. Yeah.
Just as the token social scientist here as well, there's a really important dimension to knowing the context and letting the farmer make those decisions. And the farmers, you know, a lot of farmers who are about to start this transition are feeling an incredible amount of pressure right now, particularly in the English context, and are not going to want to make one change and see how that goes, and then another change and see how that goes. They want to go in with everything they can right now and see how they can improve their farm in a fairly radical manner potentially. So letting the farmers continue to take the lead, and science following on and doing the best we can, I think, is really important.
There was a question back here. I saw someone put their hand up.
Oh, there
Yes, there is again. Covered in spiders. Are you covered in spiders? Oh, it's not just me.
Hi, thank you. Bruce Gardner, Landscape Recovery Project Officer, ecologist. What have you found to be the most common limiting factor or factors that are affecting the continuity of past and current research, which has led to the unresolved literature study outcomes?
How long you got? I'd say lack of funds, short-term thinking, 3-year projects when you're trying to manage a 10-year transition, not enough people working together. Yeah, it's a disaster, but we need to work to change that somehow. And I don't think there are easy answers, but the first one is to accept it, right? So yeah, I could talk for hours on this, but we haven't got hours. But these are all really important issues. We're not working effectively together.
Follow up on that as well, but also with there's so many different soil types and so many different management types and farm types as well. So that's obviously must be quite a constraint as well, especially in England.
Yes, we're only really just tickling the surface about where different practices could be most effective and how the degree to which your texture controls that. I mean, that's the most fundamental issue I think we really still haven't bottomed out. It's incredible, isn't it? After 300 years of agricultural research, the most basic ones still aren't really properly understood. So we've got that problem too.
Yeah, and there's the issue of scaling. So, you know, I've got these 2 experiments at 2 sites. Andy's got his experiments, and, you know, we work on research, we work on commercial farms, but you're still only talking about dozens. So you're immediately constrained by how, you know, the scale at which you can measure and how much of that variability in the landscape you can capture, which I think there's a real opportunity for citizen science and these different data models. If everyone's measuring their soil carbon for SFI, or everybody's doing biodiversity habitat monitoring, or you've got acoustic sensors or whatever, finding ways of making those data open and shareable and accessible such that we don't have these little packets of data for individual farms, but we find ways somehow of combining those data so we can scale and find some of these bigger, so doing science in a different way. And taking advantage of all the data that you guys have got.
Yeah, and policy is evolving to sort of follow up behind that right now, because we have all that soil testing, land management plans, IPM plans now being funded and supported. But yeah, the mechanisms through which we share that data and enable farmers to still feel comfortable, we haven't got that balance just yet, I think. But you said you worked for a landscape recovery project. Wouldn't a few landscape recovery regenerative agriculture projects be amazing? 30 years to kind of kick ass and look at that with a group together would be amazing.
Okay, it's one over there.
Kick ass. No, I think that's a great thing to say.
Hi, was it on? Yeah, it is. Quentin Martin from Dig & Co. Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering, since we're talking about evidence, whether you might be able to elaborate on some of the common assumptions about regenerative agriculture that you could possibly disprove, you know, that are sort of false facts which are thrown around a lot of the time.
I think it's not so much that there's false facts. I think that the issue, as I said earlier on, is that for some of the things we still don't necessarily have the evidence. So it's unresolved, or it's very mixed, and this comes down to context again. And going back, linking that back to some of the previous points about working scientists and farmers working together. We have our set experiments, and they have to be very rigorously put together, but that means they can often only look at one small thing, whereas there's so much work going on farm. So I'm quite interested to hear what Andy's going to be talking about later, about how you can maybe bring both of those things together. But I think it's maybe not so much that anybody's being told wrong things, it's just that sometimes things aren't necessarily based on established evidence.
My particular bugbear is an over-concentration and interest, with respect to John, of biodiversity in soil, because it's so vast that it's very difficult to for instance, when we sequence the microbial community in soil, we find about 50,000 organisms. So understanding which of those 50,000 is important is really difficult, and if you lose 150 of them, is that important? So that I'm saying it's great as a microbiologist. I really would encourage you to get into the soil microbiome. But a lot of what I'm seeing talked about and spoken about and sold at the moment is not really backed up by that evidence. So that's my particular bugbear. We don't know what organisms are important, right? We just don't. It's a community. How do you split a community?
But we do know that if a community has less diversity in it, then it's generally less robust.
I would agree. 10 organisms are less robust than 50,000, but are 45,000 less robust than 50,000?
Yeah.
Scientists like dancing on our pinheads and talking about diversity. There are also many different ways of measuring it, and we haven't agreed amongst ourselves how we would measure it and what it is. So, yeah, that annoys me a little.
But yeah, I think the answer is yes. We need to have an open and honest conversation about glyphosate as well.
Yes, we do.
Let's say there's some. It's always bad. Glyphosate's terrible. It kills worms. It kills people. All the rest of it. Let's have an honest and open conversation about the costs and benefits of glyphosate use. And that's be where I'd stop.
There's lots of work on the effects of glyphosate on earthworms. But you never see anything published about the effects of a plough on earthworms.
Exactly. So it's if you're not going to use glyphosate, right? Anyway, that's for another session. There's some questions over here, but I know some open and honest conversation about some of the trade-offs. Yeah.
Hi there. I live on a regenerative farm in North Shropshire, but I'm actually a historian, and I'm quite interested in your talk about interdisciplinary collaboration. And I just wonder whether any of you have worked with historians. There's a huge amount of information out there about how things were done in the past. I know we're all looking to the future, but there's quite a lot that can be learned from the past. I get the sense there's quite a lot of assumption being made about how things were being done in the past. Is there anybody that you know of, or are you yourselves looking to research elements of history, of archives, to understand how things were done before, say, the 20th century?
No, but come and talk to us.
Yeah,
we're not far away from you at Harper.
So we do. So Rothamsted have these long-term experiments which were started in the 1840s and 1850s, and those plots, if you look at them from one angle, they're a space for time series. So some of those plots have for example, the fertilizer inputs that we would have had, 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare added rather than 180. So you can look at the effect of that, for example, on the weed flora, and we've done some work that in reduced input systems you get a more diverse weed flora, but it's less competitive. So there's some things we do on that level, but no, not directly, but perhaps we should be working with historians. Thank you. Go. What? Take the microphone.
Hi, I'm Mary Stewart. I'm here from National Life Stories at the British Library. We're an oral history charity, and we are conducting life stories across whole loads of fields, including in science and in agriculture. So my colleague Paul Merchant here, wave your hand please, has been doing lots of work recently on an oral history of land management and farming. We're also working currently with the University of Exeter on an amazing project thinking about understanding how past projects have worked on biodiversity research, what's worked, what hasn't, but looking back 10 or 15 years ago, and we're looking through a personal testimony approach. So we're wanting to understand about the science, but also about all of the social connections, the networks, and how knowledge is exchanged. So I have printed out some leaflets. So if you want to come and see me afterwards, this could be the transformative event for people finding out more about our wonderful interviews. So thank you very much for allowing me to pinch the microphone, and thank you so much for your question.
Excellent. I reckon we've got time for one or two more. If anyone, there's a chap here in the front. Oh, there's one. I beg your pardon. Yes, you go ahead. Yeah.
Hi there.
Did we miss a question in between? Oh, is that okay? Sure.
Alon, English is not my first language. I'm a consultant from Israel, and as a consultant, I'm faced with many problems of debated questions, like having two different oppositions. Like, I would really like you to maybe talk about cover crops and cover crops having like a competition with your crop. So from what for me it's a debate. It's a living debate. Like, is there a competition? Is there not competition? Is it a context base? Obviously, but yeah. And maybe a second like follow up in terms of like biology. Is there a place for microscopy, or are we going into genome only genome?
Which way first?
Okay, so so when you're talking about cover crops or companion cropping and undersowing and it's always a balancing act, isn't it? So I think science can make a real contribution there. I mean, we have plant competition models that we can run and inform the practice. I'm not going to answer this very well, but yes, we can help inform that trade-off, but it's difficult.
Yeah, so some of it will depend what you put together as well. So theoretically, having two things together, as long as they are dissimilar enough, will actually enhance each other, so your overall productivity would be greater. However, if you're putting something down as a cover crop to stabilise the soil, for example, and then planting a crop into that, and it's only the second crop is the thing you're harvesting, then the yield of that is likely to be lower than it would have been if it had been planted alone. Unless, of course, the cover crop has really enhanced your soil in some way. So some cover crops will suppress diseases, for example, or, if you've had a drought or a flood, they may have helped in that way. So it depends. It's very much context dependent. Yeah.
Andy, do you want to do the
very quickly? I'll put my hand up and say, I haven't smelt the wonderful volatiles coming off a petri dish for a long time. All my work is now in silico, but both is happening, and I think different techniques are useful for different groups. So, for instance, we know how to grow a lot of organisms that live in the rhizosphere pretty well. So, understanding how we might improve the beneficial microbes, particularly those that are interacting with the plant, because we have a good idea of what they require for their growth. There's a lot of the work that is still going on, conventional microbiology. But of course, when you get away from the further away from the plant you get, the more you have to use sequencing, because we can only grow a fraction of 1% of everything that lives in the soil, microbes. So if we need to understand how those ungrowable communities work, and we can't grow them because they're dependent upon each other for chemicals and metabolites that we just don't understand yet, we have to use sequencing to try and understand that. So I think my colleagues would probably argue that there's too much sequencing going on and not enough old school microbiology, but I think it's horses for courses. If you're interested in plant interactions, then you can grow them and you can understand them as individual organisms. But when you go out into the middle of a field and you want to know what's going on deep underground, we can't grow them, so we have to sequence them.
Okay, let's have this one last question. I do apologise. Do come and catch us outside afterwards. We'll hang around for half an hour at the back there. Yes, go ahead.
So Antonia Eastwood, RSPB, I'm a social scientist. So what I'd be interested to know, I've heard a lot of talk about lack of evidence, lack of science, we just don't know. So are there ways through your project that you are harnessing sort of the knowledge from farmers and incorporating that as part of the evidence base? So we've got both scientific knowledge and farmer knowledge coming together for the evidence base, because what I hear is a lot of farmers are seeing, experiencing, observing, tacit knowledge, experiential knowledge. They're out there day in, day out in the field. So just about that combining knowledge bases.
Yes, is the short answer. Lots of projects that are doing that. So we're involved in some projects that are collating research evidence, but also collating farmer-based evidence. And I'm sure all of my colleagues here will be doing similar.
So again, Andy's session, we just need to be better at creating the vehicles to do that efficiently.
But things like innovative farmer programs, so run by the Soil Association, is about that. Yeah. It's about getting farmers with an idea, working with someone that could help them sort of trundle through the data to demonstrate a scientific evidence for it. So it is happening. Was it about us capturing their experience?
We're going to have to take this conversation outside because they need to prepare for the next session. But thank you very much for giving us your last hour. I appreciate that. Enjoy the rest of the day.